So welcome to our Scotland, Erin Roman, Director of the European Smoke-Free Partnership.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us at our Scotland's Learning Day and today. Can you tell me a bit about your background and how you got into working on tobacco?
I think the best way to probably start is to first say that I'm from South Africa. And the reason why I say that is because growing up in South Africa really sort of opened myself up, I would say, to, on the one hand, recognizing that there's significant problems in the world. And South Africa was a really good, I would say, sort of base to be exposed to that. And so during my studies, that was sort of the guiding force between sort of the things that I did next to my studies. I actually started out doing politics, philosophy, and economics. That was sort of my core focus initially. I really had ambitions of sort of going into politics, and then I saw how dirty it sort of was for me, and then I moved into economic science, finance, so really sort of the business world. I then moved to Belgium to pursue sort of a master's in finance. And then I realized very, very quickly, I think it was sort of innate, that finance and sort of financial analysis was not sort of my thing. And the reason for that is because I was always sort of seeking that my career had a positive impact on the world. And I think that was sort of guided a lot of the decisions that I made in terms of my career. I then ended up doing research in healthcare management. And so they were looking for a researcher who could apply economics and finance to healthcare settings, all about trying to find operational efficiency, trying to identify sort of, if you put a patient through a treatment pathway, what would be the cost of treatment upfront. So, you know, you could, if somebody was diagnosed with cancer, you could upfront say what that was. So my research took me into the field of healthcare, and then I started learning, you know, about diseases and sort of risk factors that actually cause severity on, and I studied in depth breast cancer. And obviously the use of tobacco is one of those risk factors in terms of, you know, severity. And I was sort of aware of that, and I really liked the idea of moving into healthcare, using my economics and finance background in healthcare. At the end of my PhD, I was very frustrated, I would say, with the connection of research and translating that into policy. So I really tried to do a lot of my research for policy and not really for academia. I then applied for a fellowship with the School for Moral Ambition. So it's a sort of, I would say it's a new kind of way of trying to apply that economic spirit or that entrepreneurial spirit with a moral base. So really something around impact. And that was actually how I ended up in tobacco. So I was selected as a tobacco fellow. I joined Smoke-Free Partnership as a fellow initially, and then I was going to stay on at Smoke-Free Partnership, and then Lilia, my predecessor, she left, and then I applied for the director. She actually encouraged me to apply for the position, and that's how I ended up sort of in tobacco control at Smoke-Free Partnership.
That is such a rich background of experience to bring, because you started off by seeing inequalities in action, harming people's lives, curbing where they can go. And you added to it that awareness of business and economics and finance. So how translatable is some of that experience and those insights to the work you're doing now?
Well, I think first of all, it's quite a unique background in the space. So I would like to say that there's just a handful of people who actually come from sort of an economic and finance background and who are now working in public health. So I think that in itself is a massive sort of value added. I recognize indeed, I think that understanding inequality and sort of the root cause of inequality and what inequality does in terms of being the breeding ground for addiction and those types of things. So understanding that, and then also very clearly understanding what drives business decisions. how to categorize how to do product segmentation, how to identify your core consumer. That understanding really sort of the core drivers of business has had a massive impact on how I look at, for example, the industry, so looking at the tobacco industry. Whenever we kind of face challenges and problems, my first instinct always is to think like the industry. And I think that that's something which I don't necessarily see very often. So I use words sort of like strategic framing, and systemic thinking about how everything interconnected. And I recognize as well that when you start to speak to stakeholders who don't have a public health background, you're more likely to be able to connect with them because you can speak sort of this universal business language. So I definitely see that that background has had massive impact on how I try to frame the work that we do.
So have you engaged with how tobacco companies are thinking? Have you sort of explored their business motives and directions?
I mean, I use as well sort of significant words of like the triple bottom line. I look at profit margins, I look at market share. If you understand those sort of aspects, then you're getting a lot closer to understanding how and why the industry does certain things and certain actions that they take. And so, for example, their marketing scheme, their marketing efforts, I mean, there's nothing unique about it. This is something that you see across different industries, and if you can understand that basis, I think it's very easy to sort of infiltrate the way that you work. And what I'd like to say is you move from being reactive to proactive, and that's a little bit what I struggled with initially coming into public health, is that it's very reactive and not proactive. And I recognize that we're under-resourced, absolutely, but I don't think that being under-resourced means that you have to stay in a state of reactiveness. So I think that that's something that I'm, actively in a business mindset trying to enforce within Smoke-Free Partnership.
That sounds very positive by way of a direction. Could you explain to me what a triple bottom line is? I've heard of the bottom line, I didn't realise there were three.
So it's a sort of phrase that there's profit. You look at sort of your profit margin. A lot of it is also sort of linked to people. We play sort of business games, so you've got sort of your triple bottom line in terms of your profit, your people, the planet. That's how we kind of sort of phrase it, right? And people is sort of your organization, how happy your organization is, and businesses recognize that if people in your organization are not happy, they're not going to perform, and that has an impact on your profit. The shareholder value is also a very important sort of buzzword that you use and now planet becomes quite important as well in the space of social responsibility that corporations have. And so it's always that kind of dynamic and framing that you have to take into account.
It's fascinating because you're so right. We tend to be reactive. We're picking up on the damage, we're picking up on the cost, we're trying to deal with what's happening now, whereas business is probably forecasting, 5-10 years where they're going next?
Absolutely. I mean, if you're talking about business and you're talking about sort of strategic planning, and every year you kind of have to do your budgets and your strategic planning. And there's always time frames in business language, so short-term, medium-term, long-term framing. And that's a little bit what I struggle with as well. We're so focused on sort of now, and then we don't actually, keep our eye out on sort of what's going to potentially happen in the future. And so that's always where the business or the industry will be one step ahead, is that we're still worrying about this kind of level of prevalence, etc., and they've moved on to something else from a strategic perspective. And so I always try to say, okay, from a strategic perspective, what are we going to do? What are we going to focus on? And I think that that's a mind shift that needs to happen. And don't get me wrong, I think that you can do public health, and public health can be your core essence, and I saw that when I applied economics and finance in healthcare management. The end goal is to keep people healthy, and so the end goal doesn't change. It's just about how to strategically position yourself to get to that goal. That needs to be worked on, in my opinion.
So, without giving away any strategic secrets, where do you think we could apply pressure to the industry? Where can we make them sit up and take notice of the harms and of public health consequences?
That's interesting. I think this is sort of the conversation that keeps sort of recurring, is children. I really think that that's the essence that we have to get down to. If you look at, unfortunately, what is happening now is the industry is, as much as they say they're not, they need, in order for their industry to, the continuation of the tobacco industry means that you need to have consumers, right? And so you've already addicted a massive amount of consumers, and as the population moves into an aging population and eventually sort of die off, unfortunately, what that means is you need to replace that, because you're not changing the fundamentals of your business. You're still producing a harm product, and you're now looking for a new generation of customers. And so I think that their main strategy is, how do we get those customers, how do we get those consumers? Because without customers and consumers, there is no industry. And so I think that that's something, if you talk about strategically, I'm very curious. I would love to be a fly on the wall in some of those executive meetings, strategic meetings, actually, when you talk about sort of on a board level, and you make sort of market projections. I wonder if anybody in that room is sort of wondering or concerned of their own children and their own grandchildren and you know, the generations still to come. I wonder if that ever crosses their mind in those discussions around the fact that their industry is, the way that the continuation of the industry is literally centered on getting young people addicted to their product.
That's very interesting. And taking that economic perspective and applying it to the advocacy organisations like Ash Scotland and Smoke Free Partnership and the others, what I'm seeing is resources are being cut and drying up, and we are having to do more and more with less and less, and there is such a passion and such commitment among these organisations. But how can we think a little more like a business in terms of the funding that we have and the work that we do? What should we be paying attention to that perhaps we're not?
Well, I think that the first important thing to note is we're probably doing very good work. If the industry is doing its utmost for there to be sort of financial cuts towards organizations who are trying to, I would say, put out a good message into the world, I think that that's a show that we're doing the right thing. I think that they probably are recognizing that the more people with economic sort of backgrounds who come into this, they threaten, I would say, the legitimacy of industry, because we understand industry. And so I think that's a big threat for them. I think that they were probably comfortable with people with health backgrounds or very focused health backgrounds, because when you talk or you have arguments with those people, it's very much centered around health. And if you have an argument with somebody who understands economics, it's not about necessarily health. They know how to link it to the things that matter for industry. And so I think the result of funding cuts means that we have to get comfortable with the uncomfortable as an organization, as civil society organizations. And it might be that we have to look at alternative ways of funding, and then that means that you would have to look at sort of business models, unfortunately, as much as we sort of try to avoid that. But I think that would be the reality, is we're not trying to make a profit. That's one of the fundamental differences between a civil society organization and industry. But there needs to be this recognition that the work that we are doing requires some type of remuneration, right? And so I think that's why I like to say it. You have to get comfortable with the uncomfortable. So it means if you need to charge for the work that you're doing, then that will have to be the reality of it. No other organization or if you look at different sort of industries function without there being some type of remuneration to the work that we do. And so if governments are not making health a priority, somebody else needs to be making health a priority. And so it means that we as organizations need to come together and say, if this is the reality, would we rather that all organizations become bankrupt, or would we rather agree that we start charging for the work that we do? And we're not trying to make a profit, but we're just trying to make sure that our livelihoods of people who are working in this field, that we can cover the livelihood of people working in this.
And does that mean that we need to be talking about social capital, about the long-term cost effectiveness of prevention work, about...
Absolutely, because if you think about it, and this is where it kind of gets a bit sort of confusing, because there's this assumption that government needs to pay for health, right? There's sort of this implicit assumption that the government, that's why if you look at how funding works, so if you look at philanthropists and things, they are more likely to fund sort of newer startup ideas where they can definitely see the ROI, so the return on their investment. And there's sort of a big conversation happening that philanthropists and people who have money that want to fund good causes in the world, they don't necessarily recognize health as being what they need to prioritize their funding towards. So that's something that is quite important to recognize, is there's this idea that governments should be covering these costs. That's an incorrect sort of assumption, in my opinion. It's not. I think the governments need to recognize that prevention shouldn't be sort of a T's and C's apply. It should actually be the bold forefront of how we talk about healthcare. And if we kind of move towards discussions around prevention, we might actually see a massive or significant reduction in the pressure, the financial pressure that healthcare system is currently facing. So that would be a lot of diseases, not only diseases that are directly caused as a result of tobacco, smoking, or anything related to that. And I think that there is sort of a nuanced approach there, that if we collectively actually start talking about prevention, would be interesting to see how that has a trickle effect on the financial burden on the healthcare system. And then you could argue that the governments have a lot more money, to fund sort of more preventative initiatives than a lot of it being injected to keep people alive who are very ill.
Yes, and ultimately it's good for business if there are healthy consumers buying their products, healthy products, if there are healthy workforce delivering those products. That is good for business, that is good for people.
I absolutely, that's always what I struggle with, really, is this. I mean, during COVID was kind of the best example. For a very brief moment, the world kind of stood still, because there was this sort of recognition that the world doesn't function without healthy people. And I'm still a little bit surprised that we haven't learned that as a sort of fundamental. Nothing works. If people are sick, they can't go to work. They can't be sort of contributing participants in society. They are then a burden on society, and then a larger burden on it's the family members, etc., around that person. And so for me, it's quite confusing to be very clear that we don't actually focus on keeping our population healthy as they possibly can. And you talk about now retirement ages being increased, etc. That could work if people actually stayed healthier a lot longer. Then you could potentially have a population that can work until 70 and be in really good health. Of course, that's sort of a blurred lines of whether people want to work until they're 70. But it's just about if you want to go to the economics of it, if you want to have sort of a well-functioning economy, you need to have healthy people at the center of it.
So it's about adding years to life and life to years.
And that's an important point. It's the quality of life, actually. So it's not about just adding life years, it's about adding better quality of life to people. So it's all about qualities, that's sort of the acronym, right? If we can get that as high as possible, then we do get into sort of a more well-functioning economy, which is basically, what most governments want.
Thank you. I spent a lot longer on the economic stuff than I meant to, because it's fascinating to hear your informed view on that and on the work we do. So thank you so much for that, Erin.